We are live. Welcome, folks, to the latest installment of the Coaches Connect series. I'm Coach Jeremy, and today we're joined by a lovely group of coaches. But we also have a special guest in the house today. We got resident PN Big Brain Brian St. Pierre joining us today, and he's going to give us a little bit of a demo as well as some time for Q&A about one of PN's most valuable tools, a tool that sometimes sits in the background just because people are unsure of how to work with it. Our PN nutrition calculator. Brian is the architect behind the PN nutrition calculator. He is the knower of all things. Often, when the rest of our team is left scratching our heads about, Brian, we got this question from the community. What do? He cracks his knuckles, sits back, and gives us all the answers. So today, he's coming live to help us answer some of those questions as well as navigate the tool so that we as coaches can effectively use it with our clients. So, Brian, I'll let you take it away, and maybe you want to start a little bit with what are you working on these days at PN?
Yeah, I mean, as usual, I've been at PN for a long time, so I'm always working on lots of different things at the same time. So we're exploring some options for like some future courses, some future like consumer potentially facing programs. I'm not actually 100% sure how much I can share because they're not necessarily fully solidified, right? They're things we're exploring, but I'm always also working on articles and videos and things of that nature. So, and helping with the coaching team, but pretty much, yeah, I'm usually a little bit all over the place. I have my hands in all kinds of pots at PN, right? I'm the director of performance and nutrition. Any course you've ever taken at PN, I'm probably a co-author of. So, yeah, that's me, and obviously, as Jeremy said, the creator of said calculator.
That is awesome. We are lucky to be seated at the table with you today. But our topic for today is mostly in regards to our PN nutrition calculator. We get questions about it all the time from coaches about how to best use it, how to manipulate certain variables, how do I utilize it with clients once I have all the numbers and all the data in front of me. It can be slightly overwhelming, uh, and we have it available to our broader audience as well on the website. So if coaches are having a little bit of struggle with utilizing this information, I assume other folks may be as well. But today we're going to focus on the coaching lens and how do we utilize it with our clients the best. Brian, kick us off. Let's
All right.
start with, I guess, a demo of the program, correct?
Yeah, I will share my screen. Hopefully, I have three screens, so hopefully I'm sharing the right one. Everyone can see the nutrition calculator. Yes.
Yep, it looks like we're
Awesome.
starting at just entering kind of some of the basic
Yeah.
information.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm going to enter my own details. So, all right, you enter name, weight, height. You're all going to learn my age. All right, soon to be 40. And you'll notice when you're in
I'm
here, right, you
shocked.
can flip flop between like imperial and metric. And then there are all these little info buttons throughout the calculator that have lots of useful information if you're unsure about something, right? So if I click on the info button next to the client levels, which you'll learn about in your level one textbook and other courses you might take through us. So this is like a fundamental approach that we use. All right, we focus, I would say most clients are level one. It says it right here, and this should actually probably be bolded. Assume they're level one until they show you otherwise, right? The vast majority of clients you're going to work with are going to be level one. Level two would be like a more advanced client looking to, push the limits on like performance or aesthetics. And level three is someone who's like paid for how they look, right? Someone preparing for a photo shoot, something along those lines. So more often than not, you're sticking with level one. But if you choose a level two, it gives you more options to play with, right? You can see what the calculator assumes or estimates someone's body fat percentage to be, as well as their resting metabolic rate, which it uses to make calculations about calorie needs. You can click the little custom button and override that if you want to. Um, right? Just like here, if someone's had their resting metabolic rate measured and they're a more advanced client, you can override it. If it's a level one client, I would not worry about these inputs, right? The main purpose of a calculator and the results is an educated starting point. So futzing with some of like these minute numbers. If it's like, oh, well, really, their resting metabolic rate was, 800 and 1850, like 40 calories for a level one client, they're not there. That's within a measurement error, right? So it's not even really worth playing with some of those things with the vast majority of your clientele. Like I almost never play with those things when I use the calculator, but it's there if you need it when you have more advanced people. But more often than not, I would stick with level one. So you'd enter the details, right? And you move on to their goal. And we have several different goal options. And if you click on them, you'll see little like descriptive information that gives you an idea of what each of them is for. So losing weight, obviously, looking to lose body weight, at least 10 to 15 pounds, likely more, because we also have something called body recomposition, where the goal is to lose like no more than 10 to 15 pounds, possibly even not lose any body weight, but to lose body fat and gain muscle at the same time. Right. So this one puts you in a small deficit instead of the deficit being adapted to like how much you want to lose and in what time frame. It sets it at like 10% under their maintenance calorie needs. So it's a relatively small deficit with high protein intake. So the idea is you're trying to help build muscle and lose fat at the same time. So you'll see some of the differences in some of these goals, right? Building muscle is going to put them in a calorie surplus, depending on how much they want to gain and in what time frame. Same thing for losing weight. So for athletic performance, this is a similar to body recomposition. It's just giving like a 10% buffer increase in calorie intake to support like highly active individuals who it's not even always well captured how active they are because they're not just training, they're in practice, they're doing skill stuff. Like they're just much more active than the average individual. Even someone like, say, like us who exercises regularly, it's not the same as a higher level athlete who's practicing multiple hours a day, training, things of that nature. And then lastly, we have improve health. So this is just like a weight maintenance calorie intake, right? The idea here is there is no desire to change body weight. They're just looking to maybe eat better, change up their macronutrient intake, perhaps eat more fruits and vegetables, fewer processed foods, things of that nature. So that's what that goal would be for. And if anyone has questions while I'm demoing this, please raise your hand. I'd love to tackle it in the moment, then go all the way through this and be like, hey, remember on the very first thing you were sharing, I had a question, right? So by all means, raise your hand and let me know. And Jeremy can tap
So
me on the
Brian,
shoulder. Yeah, go ahead, Jeremy.
yeah, yeah, sure. Actually, I had a question, and then we'll go to Enzo next. Maybe we'll
Mhm.
have the same question. We'll see. So when working with clients, there's quite a bit of overlap between some of the selected goals. But if you notice that a client has multiple goals, and you're doing this maybe with their participation, or you're doing this outside of a session, is there a reference that you would use to say, like, let's click this one first. Let's use this selection choice first before we tackle some of their other goals. How do we put them into into an appropriate hierarchy?
So, meaning like if they want to lose body fat and then like gain muscle later, or they're not really sure, like give me some examples.
Yeah, so an example might be I want to lose some body fat, but I want to improve my athletic performance.
Yeah, so the way I would think about that is like in order of preference, I would go for losing the body weight first because the athletic performance, like I mentioned, is giving you like a 10% buffer over maintenance, even with the increased activity that you'll put in, because it essentially assumes that we're undercounting how active the high level athletes are. So if this isn't a high
Gotcha.
level athlete, if it's someone who's like even if they're relatively active, 7 to 10 hours a week of activity, that is
Mhm.
like not a lot compared to say like a professional athlete or someone training for a triathlon or like an Ironman triathlon kind of thing. So I would only use that one for higher level outputs. Ultimately, I would generally aim for like body change stuff first, but it all depends on if they're training for a race or if they're training for um, a particular time frame for a particular event, we would weight it together. So I'd ask them, okay, these two things have kind of different endpoints for like calorie needs and macronutrient needs. Which one is most important to you right now? Right. So that's a question I would flip back to the client and kind of get a sense of what they're most ready, willing, and able to do first. And of course, I can give my input on what I think makes the most sense from like a physiological perspective or logically makes the most sense to me. However, if they're like, no, I really want to focus on this race and this is what's most important to me, like obviously losing weight can help with that. We also want to make sure they're eating enough to support their training and support their performance. So I would get a good sense of like what it is they want to prioritize right now. But I would have a hierarchy in my own head as well.
Fantastic. So using your own coaching experience, helping to guide that conversation, kind of tease out some of the fine details. And
Exactly.
then one additional question that pops up there is athletic performance. It sounds like this is not so much geared towards kind of our weekend warriors or like co-ed rec league soccer player who plays once or twice a week.
Right.
This is not for them. And
No.
there are other pathways that we can help them to improve their performance, maybe a little bit more skill based or more specific to the sport as opposed to nutritional intervention right away.
I mean, it can still be nutritional intervention, but their goal might might just be like improve health, or maybe they want to change their body composition, right? Gain some muscle, lose some fat, but not really change their weight much at all. And then we would account for their activity in the activity section, right? So, that's kind of how I would think about that. The athletic performance is really like, okay, we're supporting people who are highly, highly, highly active, who we probably have so if you, for example, if I skip ahead, right? We've got a weekly purposeful exercise, even at very intense. It's kind of like tapping out at like 7 to 10 hours of,
Mhm.
of exercise a week, right? So, and you can play with this physical activity multiplier. So let's say they're training a ton, but they have a pretty light job, right? Like they sit at a desk a lot of the day, but they get up and move around. This might not be appropriate for them. And you can override this, right? You can custom override this. And again, those little info buttons, right? It tells you a bunch of information there, right? When in doubt, it's better to underestimate than overestimate. But if you have an individual who is 10, 15, 20 hours a week of exercise and training, that's going to be very
Mhm.
different than someone getting in 7, 8, 9 hours, right? I mean, it's just
Right.
dramatically more. And obviously, it's not as additive as we like to imagine. There are other things that will come down, but it's still overall output is still going up. So you can override that here, or you can just let it be its thing and choose athletic performance in that scenario for those highly, highly
Gotcha.
active people. For a weekend warrior, someone like myself exercises 45 minutes to an hour, maybe most days, plays men's league hockey, goes mountain biking on the weekends in the summer. Like I'm active, but I'm not 20 hours a week active.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you for that. Enzo, I'm going to toss to you. Do you have a question?
Yes. Hey, hello, Brian. Hello, Jeremy. Hi, everybody. I have
Oh,
a quick question for you. Can you hear me?
yes, you're good.
Awesome, awesome, perfect. Yeah, so my question is, I'm starting out, and obviously my first client is gonna be myself and my father. And I was checking the calculator, so it's perfect timing. I had a couple questions on that. So, right now I'm in average about 20. I was using the calculator. I was about 21% body fat. I
Yep.
want to get to about 14%. Um, I consider myself having a little bit of what's called skinny fats. And that's probably a term that I've seen online. And my problem is I think I have not taken enough protein in the past when I work out. So that's a big focus. So my question on that, based on that, um, do you recommend to go, because my goal is to get maybe about 13%, 14% body fat from 21%. I heard you just said that sometimes body composition, you don't lose a lot of body fat, but you gain more muscle because it gives you a little bit more protein. I think that's what you said. So based on that, do you recommend which one to use? Either first cut first the fat and then or gain the weight, or what would you recommend? Or use body composition is the best one based on what I said.
Yeah. I mean, so ultimately, here's how I would think about it. I would think anything that you choose, I would treat it as an experiment. So like I would probably choose for someone like yourself, like body recomposition, because we're trying to hopefully increase some muscle mass while losing some body fat, right? So we'd still be leaning you out more than we would be gaining muscle. But the idea is you would be gaining muscle in the process as well. Not a ton, but certainly helping there, certainly preventing any lean mass loss. So this tends to work well in people who like are in your position, or someone who was previously like bigger and leaner who is now detrained, or someone who's never really exercised at all. You see it in the literature all the time. It's far less effective for someone who's more advanced or has been training consistently and hard for a long
Right.
period of time. But this can be a great option, and then you test it and you see how it's working for you for a while. Ultimately, like you're probably going to have to do a little bit of everything at some point. Transition to, okay, now I'm going to need to gain some more muscle mass so that I can then lose some more body fat. So like you can get closer to your body fat goal and still have adequate amount of lean mass. But this would be a really good place to start. And then you can decide from there, like, okay, do I want to keep trying to add lean mass? Because once you get to a point, like even doing this for say like a year, it's going to get harder and harder to recomposition. Like you're just end up spinning your wheels at some point. So when you do gain muscle mass, though, you are going to gain fat mass with it, right? Like if you're trying to add weight, that is just a normal, expected part of the process. And then you can always lean out afterwards. So I would probably start with recomposition and then progress to like adding muscle and then eventually losing some unwanted body fat. But the nice thing about those two options is you can choose like a time frame, right? Like let's say my goal weight was to be 185. And so it kind of tells me, it gives me some ideas. And this, right, fun little info button helps you understand what those things are, right? So for building muscle, it tells you what those, because the terms there, comfortable, reasonable, and extreme are a little bit different for building muscle. But for losing weight, they're really referring to like comfortable is like less than 0.5% of your body weight per week. Reasonable is 0.5 to 1% of your body weight per week. And as extreme is like well over 1% of your body weight per week, which I would generally not recommend. This is generally the sweet spot to aim for. So for me, I'd probably aim for like, give myself like 8 to 10 weeks, right? Which would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, so end of July. So, somewhere around mid-August, end of August. And that'll help ensure that my calorie deficit is reasonable as well, right? Because oftentimes people will choose very aggressive timelines and then they wonder why they get to their results and it's like eat 1,100 calories a day. That's what it would take to lose 10 pounds in 6 weeks or something, right? So that's kind of how I would think about that. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Even just to clarify a little bit more, even with the body recomposition, even with that one, you said I'm gonna be bulking, but I'm not gonna be losing a lot of weight, or you think I'm still gonna be able to lose a little weight with the body
So
recomposition?
body recomposition, if you look right here, right, the idea with body recomposition is you're more likely than not you're in a deficit. So you're going to be losing some weight, right? So body composition, recomposition puts you in a 10% calorie deficit, 10% below what it estimates your maintenance calories to be. So you will lose weight and you will lose body fat, but it's a small enough deficit that if you're training hard, and if you're relatively like detrained or you have like higher body fat and less lean mass than you would like, you can be gaining some lean mass too. Not a tremendous amount, not the same as you would if you were just in build muscle, but you will build some while getting leaner. And then after a stretch of that, you can kind of see where you stand and decide if you want to add more lean mass and then lean out again, or lean out first, right? You can kind of decide from there what makes the most sense for you and how you respond to something like this.
And you said this is like an experiment. So how long do you think I should experiment and see any results or not when I should make changes?
I mean, there are a couple experiments running at the same time, right? Basically, you're going to get your recommendations, and that you should be kind of playing with every couple of weeks or so. Like we have some realistic rates of progress guidelines to help you know how you should adjust like the results. But how long you should follow this goal, I'd probably give it 2 to 3 months, right? Where you're doing those smaller adjustments and seeing how it's all working for you, and then see where you stand. And then okay, Do I want to continue down this path? Am I losing some body fat and gaining muscle? Like, I'm going to ride this out until I can no longer get those results, and then you would switch. That's how I would think about it.
Awesome. Awesome. Perfect. Last question, but you can answer when you get to the diet place because I did check the percentages. So you don't have to answer now. You can answer if you like after. I'm just a little confused when we get to the diet place with the balance of the macronutrients.
I'll cover that for sure.
Yeah. What would you recommend for myself as well, based on what I'm trying to do? Thank you for your help there, Ryan.
You're welcome.
Hamid, you had something you wanted to ask as well.
Yes, hello. I just want to say, first off, this is my first Coaches Connect, so I'm not sure how things work, but I'm happy to be here. Can I just, of course, I missed the first 10 minutes of your talk. Of course, I don't expect you to repeat what you said. In just under a minute, can you just help me understand what am I looking at here? What is this calculator and why we're discussing it?
So this calculator, go ahead, Jeremy.
I'll take this one, Brian. So this is our PN nutrition calculator. It's available to all of our L1 students who have taken either the nutrition course with V4 or our SSR course as well. Actually, no, sorry, not SSR, only L1 V4, our macros course, L2, as well as PN Academy. There's also a free version of this calculator on our PN website for folks who are not enrolled in that or who are not coaches and just want to use it for themselves. So this is a tool designed to help coaches and clients to guide their nutrition choices based on what their goals are. So Brian is the creator of this, and he's just sharing how to best utilize this for yourself and for your clients. So hopefully that gives you some insight.
Thank you very much. I guess maybe that doesn't apply to me. I think I'm L1 volume version 1 or version 2, so I don't know.
Yep. If you're unsure, feel free to message us in the larger community and we'll get you sorted out there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Ryan, back to you.
Yep. So I'm going to choose recomposition for myself. And as I was showing before, now you have the activity questions. There are 2 of them, right? There's your purposeful or the client's weekly purposeful exercise, right? So things like lifting weights, going for a run, zone 2 work, rigorous hikes, that kind of thing, or even like more moderate, but very purposeful exercise. So it wouldn't include things like gardening. We can get into conversations whether it includes walking the dog or not, but really some of those smaller, lighter things are judgment calls. So, you can choose from very light, like they basically are sedentary, don't do any like purposeful activity, all the way to very intense, right? Which I showed, which is 7+ hours. And there are, options in between. And so really there, you'll see there's some overlap, right? It's 3 to 4 hours of moderate exercise, 4 to 6 of moderate to strenuous. And that's somewhat intentional because it's like people don't fit in these clear-cut boxes, right? So it's like, oh, I do a mix of things. I do some zone 2 work. I do some rigorous training. I do some intervals. I do mountain biking, whatever the case might be. And so you're just trying to pick the best one. When in doubt, choose under instead of over. So you're much better to underestimate than overestimate, because when you overestimate, then people see the results and they're like, oh my God, I can't eat 3,000 calories a day. It's never going to lead to weight loss, right? So when in doubt, underestimate activity. And then over here, you have like, daily activity, excluding purposeful exercise. So this would be like someone like myself, sitting at a desk most of the day. I might choose very light, right? Someone who's like a construction worker or really doing a lot of strenuous activity, walking around, carrying things, right, might choose something like this, right? They might choose heavy for their daily activity. Or, usually most people are somewhere in between. Oftentimes I see people overestimate this, like how active they are in their daily job. If you're not getting 10, 12,000 plus steps a day, you are certainly not in the heavy to moderate range, right? So moderate would be like a restaurant server, someone who's constantly, constantly kind of moving around, right? Rarely sitting down. This helps to basically estimate what's considered like your NEAT or your NEPA, your non-exercise physical activity. So, which all contributes to your physical activity multiplier. But when in doubt, so if I was choosing for myself, I'd probably choose intense, and very light, right? I could maybe be light. I walk my dogs every day, but I'm going to err on the side of caution on the lower end, and go from there. And I'm gonna keep that at the estimated rather than
Quick
overriding it.
question for you, Brian.
Yeah.
As coaches, is there any data we can bring to the table to help us decide which category our client or ourselves should be in? So you mentioned kind of step count is one of them. Uh, is there any other data that you collect on that front to
I
help guide
mean,
that choice?
if you know roughly how many hours a week they're doing, exercise related activities. So that's a question I always ask on like my intake forms, right? Like we have it on our initial intake form for PN where we're asking roughly like how many hours a week or how often they're exercising. And they'll say stuff like, oh, I lift weights 3 times a week for 45 minutes. And, maybe they do some cardio, or maybe it's the inverse. They do cardio 3 times a week and occasionally lift weights. So again, you are trying to pick the general best fit. You'll see they have some overlap, right, with the hours. General best fit, but erring on the lower end. Because people will often tell you what happens in their ideal week or in their best case week, as opposed to what happens every single week. So getting a sense of how often and how long and how vigorously they're exercising, I will help you answer this. But I would tend to pick like one down, because it's like, oh yeah, I do that 3 times a week. It's like, well, they do that 3 times a week, twice a month. Or the other 2 times a month, it's 2 times a week, because shit happens, right? Like life gets in the way. And so when in doubt, undershoot versus overshoot.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you. Let's keep going.
Cool. All right. So this is the fun section. So when we get to the dietary preferences, now you'll see there are a lot of things you can choose. So you have lots of different options for how people might prefer to eat. And this isn't relevant until you get to the report at the end, right? Which tells them types of foods they might enjoy, how to flesh out their macronutrient or hand portion intakes based on those type of food preferences, meal ideas. So it becomes very relevant at that point, but it doesn't change like their calorie needs or anything like that. So you can choose anything, which they have no major preferences or restrictions, a Mediterranean style diet, paleo, vegetarian, keto, and fully plant-based, which some might call vegan, but vegan's also an entire lifestyle where there are other things at play. But basically, those are your options for food preferences, right? So for myself, I'll eat just about anything. So that's what I would choose, but you have options. And then from there, you can choose the macronutrient ratios. And I think this will get to for Enzo's question. You'll see another little fun info button, right? This one's a big one. There's lots of info in there to help guide you on all the options in that drop-down menu, because there are many of them, right? We do have an entire document like that's called the Professional Calculator, How It Works, which should be in the resource center of your course, where you have access to this, which goes into further depth on everything about the calculator, its rules, has a lot of this information on the info buttons as well. But in the moment, you can also look and understand like how this all works. So that's super helpful. Generally speaking, if you choose balanced, right, it's aiming for about 30% protein, 35% carbs, and 35% fats. But you'll see these, I know it's really small, these little tildes in front of the percentages. That means approximately, right? So on improve health or body recomp, where there's not a significant like calorie deficit or it's maintenance calories, these will be pretty accurate. Once people choose like losing weight, and if they have a big deficit that they're basically told to aim for, these numbers become skewed, because if you look in here, right, the calculator doesn't set protein on a percent calorie basis. It sets it based on a grams per pound or grams per kilogram of body weight basis. And then it allocates the carbs and fats from the remaining calories there, depending on which preference you chose. So it is always setting protein first. And then if you choose balanced, it's putting the carbs and fats even with whatever's remaining. If you choose low carb, it's putting carbs at 20% and the rest to fats. and then the inverse if you choose low fat. So that's why sometimes it can appear like, oh, why aren't the percentages adding up? Because they're just meant to give you like an idea of what it's shooting for, but it is setting protein on a grams per pound or grams per kilogram of body weight basis to ensure they're getting adequate protein no matter what their calories are set at, right? Because if they need 3,500 calories at 30% protein, the protein will be set super high. If they need 1,200 calories at 30% protein, the protein would be set super low. So we are setting it on body weight basis, not a percent of calories basis. But you can play with that, right? So if you went into like custom macro percentages, you can actually set it at your own preferred exact percentage, right? So if I adjust protein down, carbs and fats will go up. If I adjust it up, they'll come down, right? So you can do lots of things, and it's telling you what the grams are while you're doing that. You can also just enter customized macronutrient grams. So let's say, okay, I want to make sure they have protein at 1.25 grams per pound of body weight. I can set that in, and it's going to tell me, right, how many grams that is and what percent of calories that is. And I want their carbs to be at, 2.5. And then I realized like, oh shit, that's actually more calories than it was even going to give me in the first place, right? Because it's negative calories remaining. So maybe I put that back at 2. I can kind of play with these things and see how it all nets out. Like, wow, I get 8 grams of fat. That would be impossible, right? So you can play with all of this. If they were an athlete and you had it they were really active and their goal was athletic support or performance, there would be a lot more room for carbs here because their calorie needs would be a lot higher than what we chose for me at body recomposition. But you can play with this and set macronutrients at different levels relative to their body weight and see how it nets out. And then you can also set it like between protein and fat, and then the carbs come out wherever they are. Like if they're someone who prefers eating a more fat-rich diet, so then the carbs are the leftovers as opposed to the fats being the leftovers. You can put it on a grams per kilogram of body weight basis instead of grams per pound of body weight basis. So there are a bunch of options here. And again, right, fun little info box tells you exactly how it works and what to do. So whenever you see these, they can be very useful in guiding you on what's happening in here. You can also override the calculator altogether, right? If you know, okay, I have a client who's been tracking macros, for example. They've been tracking macros for a year. They want to transition to hand portion. So we've talked about that as an option. You could actually enter whatever they've been eating for their macronutrients. Let's say it was something like this, right? And then I would put in how many meals a day they're having. We'll just go with 3 for easier. If you go to next, it turns those macros into hand portions. And it tells you what the calculator was going to set their calories at and what your custom input set the calories at. So if someone wants to make that transition, you can enter those and it can tell you, okay, here's what that looks like in hand portion. So that can be a really fun little tool as well for people who want to make that switch. And then there's also just a desired number of hand portions, right? If someone was eating a certain number and wanted to play with it, or wanted to know, if you wanted to know like how many calories it would be if you had 6 palms of protein, 6 fists of veggies, 6 handfuls of carbs, and 6 thumbs of fats, it would tell you like this is what it was going to tell you to eat. But if you just set it at that, here's how many calories that is and the macros it turns out to be. So there are a lot of custom options in there where you can play with things, especially if they were eating, let's say, a lot more than it's suggested. If you went through the whole process, got to the result, and it was like, man, that's a huge jump for someone to go from the 2 palms of protein they were eating, and now it's telling them to eat 8. Like, holy smokes. You could just come in here and kind of enter some custom ones and see, okay, I think they could jump to 5, right? But I have to give them a few more carbs and fats to help them get enough calories. So you can play with that. So you can kind of meet people halfway. So it's not such an enormous leap from where they are now to what the calculator is necessarily recommending, because it's a calculator. It doesn't have judgment, like professional judgment, like you do, right? So you can kind of make those modifications and those changes to best fit the needs and preferences of your clients. So yeah, that's all like I know that's probably like drinking from a fire hose. Lots of stuff coming at you. But there are lots of options here to play with things, to customize things, and to just frankly like learn. You can play with like enter those desired macro totals or play with the custom macrograms and say, oh, what would it look like if someone ate this way, right? If they went for 1 gram of protein and half their body weight in fat per day and relative to what the calculator says their calorie needs are. You can play with these kind of things, and it can be fun to see how the math all works out, right? Like, wow, if they did that, there's literally like it's a pretty balanced overall intake. That's pretty cool. So there's lots of things you can do in this diet section to learn and to play. So any questions there? I know that was a lot, but I'm happy to slow things down. Right. I'm from the Northeast. We tend to talk fast.
He has Dunkin' Donuts running or coffee running through his blood right now.
Only I
Ryan,
like
I had a few questions that just to clarify something. So one is that the kind of modifications that you made here over the last two sections, those are primarily available on the professional calculator and not available on the free calculator.
So the only thing available on the free like blog calculator would be this one, the custom macro percentages.
Gotcha. Okay.
Otherwise, all these other ones are professional calculator only.
Gotcha. Cool. One more question before we go to the Q&A. This is something that I personally was really curious about was the calculator is based on an adaptive equation that is taken from a specific data set. I believe it's the NIH data set that looks like broad population dynamics. And then it also factors in how calorie needs or energy needs change as bodies change. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so basically, it's from Dr. Kevin Hall's group at the NIH, and it's frankly like the gold standard in understanding like metabolism and what it actually takes to lose weight, and how the body adapts, not to, well, I guess to fight it, because it doesn't realize like, oh, I'm trying to lose some body fat because I want to be healthier or fitter or look better, right? It views it as a threat to your well-being. So anytime people are losing weight, the body starts to adapt to basically slow that down, right? That is a normal, natural part of the process. It varies on how hard people's bodies adapt, right? We fall on some type of distribution curve where some people's don't have a large adaptive response. Others have a very large adaptive response. But ultimately, this calculator tries to take that into account. So if I changed it to lose weight, because that's the only way it'll show it. And I went back here, right? It'll tell me I need 2,300 calories a day versus my maintenance, which is actually probably very close to my actual maintenance. I'm probably a little more active than I put in here, but that's a 550 calorie a day deficit just to lose 10 pounds in 10 weeks or whatever. Whereas if you had a larger deficit, it would be a much bigger difference because it's trying to account for as you're losing that weight, your body is now burning fewer calories because you weigh less. You're actually burning fewer calories because your body's making you more efficient. It's trying to slow and fight that, right? Over time, it'll actually try and decrease like your NEAT output. So you actually move a little bit less. Like there are all kinds of little things that are happening metabolically to try and slow that process down. So if this was over a longer period of time and a larger weight loss, you would see a much larger potential deficit here. Because of that adaptive nature of metabolism. So it's not just saying, like traditionally people would say, oh, cut out 500 calories a day and you'll lose a pound a week, right? Because about a pound of fat is around 3,500 calories. So 500 times 7 is 3,500. Voila, you will now lose a pound a week, right? However, your deficit is going to therefore shrink over time because you'll have lost some weight, right? And then all of a sudden that 500 calorie deficit will become 400 and 300. And your weight loss will slow and you'd have to drop more calories again. This takes that into account at the jump. But people can be too aggressive particularly on our blog version of the calculator, because it doesn't have these time frame estimates, right? So as a professional, this helps guide you in setting more realistic time frames for people. So like if I wanted to be 165, right? All of a sudden now it's 17 to 33 weeks, right? So really, if we're somewhere in the middle, 24 weeks, I mean, that's basically 6 months. So, but most people don't think, oh, I'm going to lose 30 pounds. It's going to take 6 months. That's not the time frame most people have in their minds, right? So that's like, oh, I'll lose 30 pounds. I can do that in 3 months. Do that over the summer. Like if I wanted to do that in 3 months, it would only be a couple more weeks than we are now, right? So even if I put it here, it would be a very so aggressive that it's literally, oh, it's 21 days. That's why it was impossible. That was June, August 14th. So 3 months would have been like here-ish, right? So now my deficit is, my intake's literally cut in half. So that's what often happens when people are too aggressive, but it's taken into account the fact that to lose that weight while your metabolism is adapting, it requires a much larger deficit than most people think. So it's usually just takes longer to reach a goal because of that adaptive metabolism than people would like to believe. So, you know, if I stretched out that time frame to 6 months, so this is June, that would be basically what? November. Now all of a sudden it's still a large deficit, but it's a more manageable deficit, right? But it's still larger than you might want to believe because of that adaptive nature of metabolism and because I chose 30 pounds, which is a, you know, significant amount of weight. But ultimately, yeah, that's how that works.
Cool. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but the way that I visualize this is if we had a graph with body weight on one axis, on the vertical axis, and then time on the bottom, that curve based on adaptive metabolism would start quite close to maintenance, and then it would slowly, gradually kind of like level off to a lower calorie intake over time. So then to start that deficit, you probably wouldn't have to drop 1,000 calories right off the bat. You can start with something more reasonable. And as their body starts to change, you'd increase the deficit over that time scale and changing body weight.
I mean, that is similar. It's not exactly the same as what this is proposing because the way the math is all working, it's saying, no, you need to be in 1,000 calorie deficit every day for that period of time, or 1,000 calories from what is now currently your maintenance. The way you're proposing is a little bit different, but it could end up working out the same, but likely you'll actually end up below this over time.
Right.
So you're starting off higher, but ending up lower, as opposed to just being here the whole time. That's another way of basically functioning with adaptive metabolism. Exactly. So, or you can even do it in
my
smaller
example, you
timeframes.
probably extend the timeline as well.
Extend the timeline or do it in smaller chunks, right? Like rather than, okay, we're going to go for 30 all at once, right? We're going to go for that 10 to start, and then another 10, and then another 10, right? And it'll modify the outputs from there. So my starting weight would be different, and now my goal weight would be different. So you can do it in smaller chunks, or you can do it over a longer period of time.
Cool.
Yes, there are multiple ways to go about that.
Awesome. Thank you. Vicky, you had your hand up.
Thanks. This might be a little bit getting into the weeds, but I'm just kind of geeking out on the algorithms of the program. So you mentioned under goals if body recomp was one of your goals.
Yep.
That it tends to focus more on protein, I believe.
It emphasizes protein, significant amount of protein. Yes.
Yeah. So then when I go to diet, how's when I go down the program, I mean, I select the goal as recomp and then it goes to diet, then it's asking me balanced, et cetera. It's still saying 30% protein.
So because it's not actually setting protein on a percentage, right? It's setting protein on a body weight basis. So a certain amount of grams per pound or per kilogram of your body weight. And then there are actually other rules that adjust it based on how active you are, right? So it's, if you have, actually, I'm going to pull it out right now.
So it's sort of I mean, that 30%, 35 that's listed under a balance isn't set in stone. It's
No,
just
not at all. That's why
okay.
there's that little. So if you look at like that little tilde right there,
Approximately.
that means approximate.
Okay,
Exactly.
got
And
it.
if you click the little info button, it tells you that, right? Like there are
Okay.
preset ones, but they
Okay.
set protein first on a body weight basis,
Right.
not on 30% of calories coming from protein.
Okay.
So like in your textbook, if you have, it would be, I think it's chapter 17. There is a large table that has all of the protein rules for the calculator right in it.
Okay,
Which one is it?
cool.
I will find it. And you can actually see what I'm referencing when it comes to like the protein intake for body recomposition. Right here. Table 17.7 on page 115. And it's showing you like the protein requirements for fat loss and body recomp. And then it depends on, so you'll see there's a range because that depends on how active they are. If someone is like lightly active overall, it sets their protein needs a little bit lower. If they're moderately active overall, it sets them a little bit higher. If they're highly active overall, like with that physical activity multiplier, if it's over 2, puts the protein needs even a little bit higher to help with recovery, to help with performance, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So it just sets protein pretty high in the body recomposition section.
Awesome. Thanks for doing that homework for me.
You're very welcome.
And then just another really quick question. We talked about this, Jeremy's describing this curve, how it starts at certain calorie intake and over the life of this time range that you pick. When you're working with clients who have quite a bit of weight to lose, would you just redo it maybe every 3 months or every so with the new weight and let it recalculate and get a better base that way?
You can also just go by what they're currently eating, right? Like, so the calculator gives you a really good starting point, but then you're going to adjust recommendations based on like what's happening with the person in front of you, right? Using outcome-based decision making. So if they're eating more or less than it said, but they're making progress, like you roll with that and you adjust based on what they are actually eating as opposed to what the calculator estimates they're going to need, right? Because that's what it is. It's a very sophisticated, educated guess. So it's giving you a really good starting point to then work from with a client, but it's not set in stone. It's not the be all end all. And it gives you lots of options to modify those based on what you know about the person in front of you. But ultimately, you can certainly play with it, especially if their goals change or timeframes change or their activity levels change significantly, right? That can help you get an idea of how to change it or how much to change it. Like oftentimes, let's say someone is starting and let's say they were, a heavier individual looking to lose a lot of weight, but they're currently only so active. And then, they work with you for 3-4 months and they've made some good progress. And now they're becoming more active. Well, that'll also change their calorie needs, especially if they also add some lean mass in the process, right? So that's where you can use the calculator again. Like they went from being like completely sedentary to now they're, exercising 3 to 4 times a week. That'll change, even for weight loss, change their calorie demands, might change their protein demands. So that's how I would think about using a calculator there. If things are just cruising along and you need to just make small adjustments, you don't need the calculator to do that. You can just help them make some 250, 500 calories a day kind of adjustments, lose some carbs and some fats in there somewhere, or be more active. But if they are becoming significantly more active, that does change some of the demands on the body. So that's when you would kind of rerun and compare to what they're currently eating, what it says, and finding some kind of type of middle ground there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, a great reminder to be client-centered. And I've never actually given the calculator spreadsheet to any of my clients because we just work on what they're eating now and reduce or add accordingly. But yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Vicky. Brian, we have a few more minutes. There's 1 or 2 questions I want to hit on.
Yep.
So one of them was based on the discussion that we had previously. was around working with clients who are on the gender spectrum. So if I'm working with someone who identifies as male or female, and maybe I'm working with someone who's non-binary, how would the calculator work in those instances?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something we really grappled with with this calculator, because like the NIH's calorie algorithm is only validated in a very binary way, right? For women, for men. So like if you actually, we have this very long info button trying to explain why it's a binary option, and then what you can do if someone doesn't fall perfectly on that binary, right? Which many people don't. So if you're undergoing like a sex or gender transition, particularly with hormones, then you would choose like the sex you are becoming, right? Or you identify as. And conversely, like if you're intersex, maybe someone would play with it and you pick like some type of like results in the middle. So you see what the results would be for male, see what the results would be for female, and then you choose options that kind of fall in between there somewhere. So ultimately, like it's a challenge because there aren't validated like algorithms for those
Right.
minority populations. But you can make like careful client-centered recommendations based on that, right? If someone identifies as a male and you want to make sure it says male on the report, you would choose male. But if you know that they are like have the hormonal status of a female, right, then you can modify some of those outputs accordingly, like right in this section. I'm going to bring down X, Y, and Z thing, right? Because I know this is set a little high because it's for a biological male or whatever the case might be. So, you can modify and play with. That's one of the reasons why some of this stuff is in here. So you can now adjust some of those things to better fit the person you're coaching, the person that's in front of you, right? So it was definitely something we grappled with and debated about a lot, like when we were creating this, and that's why we have that info button there to explain why it's only a binary option, but what to do if you don't fit neatly within those boxes, right? Or a client doesn't fit neatly within those boxes, and how to best navigate that. So that's how I would handle that situation.
Fantastic. And I think one thing to add, which you previously may have mentioned, was running multiple reports. Change a single variable and then look at the difference between those reports and start at whatever end of the spectrum that client feels more comfortable with. So you can go straight down the middle, use the calorie estimate and the portion estimates that are in lie between those two options or those multiple options. And then this is why there's a coach required here to help guide those choices and not kind of just stick at one point because that's what the calculator told me to do.
Right. Exactly. Like if you look at how we talk about in V4 and in all of our courses, like the evidence-based practice kind of model, right? So there's the best available evidence and research, which would essentially be this calculator. There's your professional or your coaching expertise, right? Your judgment you bring to the table, and the preferences of the person you're working with. And even with the calculator, you're trying to apply all three of those things. Like it is sophisticated, but it's still essentially a dumb machine, right? Like you, as the professional with your judgment, are adapting it and modifying it to best fit the needs and preferences of the person in front of you based on your expertise, your experience, and what you know will best fit this person.
Right. I think this is another conversation we had behind the scenes was the numbers that the calculator generates. If it's something that makes your client's eyeballs pop out of their head, understanding that, hey, I don't have to kind of assign those numbers and keep them fixed to that client right away. There are ways that we can either use a calculator to modify some of those numbers to be better in line with what they're currently capable of and ready to do, or we can make adjustments to timelines and things of that nature that bring that threat level down for that client and let them feel a little bit more comfortable with those initial steps forward.
Exactly. 100. And it can be a useful like conversation starter. Like sometimes I would do this like in real time with a client, like over Zoom perhaps, because they might have unrealistic expectations on how quickly they can lose a certain amount of weight. It's like, well, hey, look, if we do that, right, and you want to lose XYZ in this time frame, and you see the results, and it's like you have to eat, or a warning pops up, like this is impossible, or it would require less than 1,000 calories a day to do it. It's like, here's why professionally, like I don't recommend that to you, right? Like this is showing that, and mathematically to do that is virtually impossible or is high risk. So it can be a useful way to help illuminate that to clients. So, hey, you can still lose that much weight. It'll just be on a longer time scale, or we can choose a smaller weight loss if that date is very important to you. If that date is fixed, right? Because it's for whatever event. Here's let's find something that's probably more reasonable or possible in that time frame. Right. And if we can find ways to lose more, be more active, whatever the case might be, awesome. Right? We can explore that too. So it can be a really useful like conversation starter in that way.
100%. This could be a standalone session that you do with clients as a one-off, and it could be incredibly valuable to help illuminate some key points for them, make some, give them a way to have some guidance, and then either print out the report and let them work on it on their own, or use that as a jumping off point to deeper coaching conversations that come on later.
100%.
We have a few more minutes. I don't see any specific questions right now, but based on knowing a little bit more about your background, Brian, so folks may not know that Brian in a previous life has also worked with the highest level athletes that you possibly can in a team sports setting. I'm curious to know, is there any information here or anything that you'd particularly share with clients in a team sports setting?
So, like I said, I've worked with Cleveland Browns, San Antonio Spurs. I've worked with high-level individual athletes, Sloane Stephens, and Ndamukong Suh. You name it, I've probably worked with an athlete in that sport professionally. And so in terms of like using a report like this, I have used it. I've also we have like these athlete guides that you can download from our website from all kinds of different sports that I would hand out to players and teams. But ultimately, it depends on what I think the athlete in front of me is ready, willing, and able to like start with and take in, right? We often think of professional athletes as like, oh man, they're going to be so into their nutrition for their performance. And I'm here to tell you that is not the case, right? They fall on a bell curve, a distribution curve, like everybody else. You have some who are super engaged and interested in this, who would love an entire report and really want to take their nutrition to the next level. You have many others who it's a very minor means to an end, right? Tell me a few things to do better so I can help make weight. My coach will get off my back. Or, right, I need to get a little stronger. I'm told to come see you because the coach said I had to come see you, right? Like there are plenty of situations like that. So yes, you use this report when appropriate. I'll use the calculator still regularly because it can help guide like, okay, how much do I think this person actually needs? What are they currently taking in? If I have a sense of that, right? If we walk through a day or I get a 3-day food log, and then where are the gaps there? Like, oh, are they not getting in enough protein? Are they not getting in enough carbs for their performance needs, right? Relative to my estimations. So I'll really use it oftentimes in that population for that purpose. Like, okay, here's what I think they should be taking in, right? Based on what we know about this sport and this type of athlete. Here's what they tell me they're consistently doing, right? And where are the gaps and differences there? They may get the full report. More often than not, we just talk about those gaps and how we can overcome them. But ultimately, it depends on the person in front of me and what I think they're ready, willing, and able to take in. Like what's going to best help this individual. So I was telling Jeremy at some other time, like years ago when I'd worked with the Spurs, there was a basketball player named Manu Ginobili, who's now in the Hall of Fame. He was the most interested and like engaged athlete I ever worked with when it came to nutrition. He had more questions than probably any client I've ever had in my entire career. And I've, coached over 1,000 people at this point. So he would have loved the report and more, and literally anything I could give him. There were plenty of others who literally I would put it on a Post-it note and be like, okay, like, here's what you tell me you're taking in the 5-10 minutes that you were allotted to talk to me. They didn't necessarily want to be there. Here's what I think their needs are. Like, hey, here's some gaps we can work on and how we can fill that. So really, you're fitting it in based on by being client-centered in the person in front of you. But you can always use it to help estimate like what you think their needs are to help improve their performance and best do your job.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Brian. Mona, I see your question. I'm going to ask you actually to post it in the larger community because I think it'll be really beneficial to start a discussion there. Tag me in it. I'll get Brian's response there, but we can wrap up here for today. Thank you everyone for coming out. Brian, we appreciate your time. Super useful. And then we'll have this recording available for everyone else as of the end of the week. All right, gang. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Thank you all.